My name's Howard Tayler. I make comics, and if you recognize my voice, it's probably from writing excuses. 15 minutes long because you're in a hurry and we're not that smart. I've gotten that out of my system. I am moderating today. This is our august body of panelists from whom we're going to be getting content. My job is to talk less than they do. So if you just wanted to hear me tell jokes, stay here because I want to listen to what they have to say, which means so do you. We'll go ahead and begin with introductions. Peter?
My name is Peter Orullian. I'm currently writing an epic fantasy series for Tor. Very proud of a recent book release where I novelized my favorite band, Dream Theater's concept album. Was just contracted to write a tie-in novel for a Juilliard grad pianist, and the thing that I'm spending my immediate time on is just announced a collaboration with Brandon Sanderson. We're doing a new urban fantasy series together.
My name is Brian McClellan. I am known for the Powder Mage books, Flintlock Epic Fantasy. The sixth one of those is coming out in November, but my next release is a self-published urban fantasy in April about the collection agency that works for Hell, and that's what I do.
I'm Emily R. King. I'm a YA fantasy author. My first series, The Hand of Queen, came out the last couple of years, and my next series, Evermore Chronicles, comes out this spring. Book 1, Before the Broken Star, is in June. That's me.
Right on. Okay, so Swain scene sequel. I'm just going to go ahead and begin with a definition before throwing things to the panelists. Fundamentally, the scene sequel format, scene means stuff happens. Sequel means we talk about the stuff that happened. It's a pacing tool that allows us to have action and then reaction. And it's not as clear-cut as, a chapter of scene, a chapter of sequel, a chapter of scene, a chapter of sequel. It is a pacing tool. You don't have to have read Swain's book to understand the definition. We're going to talk about how we use it, how we have seen it used, what we like, what we don't like. And so I want to lead with this question. What are things that you've read or seen that most exemplify to you this tool for pacing? Good examples of it that maybe the audience is familiar with. Can someone swing that shut maybe in the back? She's got it.
Thoughts?
You go ahead.
Oh, man.
Well, one came to mind. It's not it's not going to be popular, but Vinci Code. Now, I was at a writers' conference where, and I'm just going to go ahead and use her name because she was very proud of her remarks, but Elizabeth George, who's a very successful mystery writer, got up and just derided Dan Brown for that book. And I think it's professional jealousy. But I read the book to understand what was successful about it. And if you know the history, there's a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, or something like that, that's 20, 25 years prior, that told a lot the same story. But the thing and people want to say, you always know when the furniture's moving in a Dan Brown novel. But I think Dan does that by design. And the thing that I think he does well is he has literal action where people are moving through space, and there's fights or whatever sort of conflict. But then he has these scenes where the characters are figuring things out. And it's a relief from the risk or the danger they're in, but the narrative momentum is still driving forward. And I think that's why his books have, I think, such good pace. Now, people may or may not like Dan Brown, but as a study and that's a thriller, and so it's supposed to have good pacing, but every novel should have good pacing. And I think the other thing to be cognizant of is, and this is the one pre-panel thought I had, is just the idea that when you're not in conflict, the tension's gone is super, super false. Some of the most tense scenes should be those where characters are in conversation and they have different goals or motivations, and those things are you can read the subtext, really great dialogue, you can read the conflict that's going on in an exchange that has no mortal risk in it. So my big takeaway for you would be scene sequel isn't about action and people then, resting and just, reflecting about their mother through the window with a cup of tea.
Yeah, I actually the Da Vinci Code is a great example because writer me looks at that book and goes, ugh. But 19-year-old me read that book in 6 hours, and I just loved it, and it moves like that. The thing that popped into my mind was the entire series of Dresden Files. It just moves along. That's another thing. Like thriller, urban fantasy, that's kind of a requirement is that it keeps moving quickly. But he does that very well. Like conflict, a lot of people will think conflict just means physical conflict. And that's a big false flag there, You're not... There is so many other ways you can do conflict. And if you're only doing physical conflict and then trying to either follow it up with staring out a window or follow it up with more conflict, people are going to get exhausted. You've got to bounce between types of conflict and keep that kind of juggling act going.
Yeah, I think it's a difference between internal and external conflict. When you're literally on the run, that is clearly very external. But whatever happens in the action sequence should propel the character into an internal conflict. So if they're on the run and a friend gets injured, then they have to deal with maybe the potential loss of a friend or the injury of a friend. Whatever it is that you follow up in the sequel part should be them not just trying to figure out what happens next to beat the bad guy. It should be how your character grows from what they just went through. Because you want them to continue up this stairway that you're pushing them towards. And if they don't show any growth, if you have a run, chase, chase and then stop, chase and then stop type book, your reader's going to get really exhausted. They want to see your character eventually have some sort of triumph. Even if it's them just figuring out emotionally that they're not going to run, they're going to just face whatever it is that's chasing them. There should be emotional growth because of that scene that is external. Does that make sense? So you should always know which conflict you are choosing, if it's internal or external. And as your book goes along, it really should come closer and closer together. Your apex of your book should be something that happens that is both external and internal. It should challenge your character both ways, not just one.
Let me layer something on to what she said, and I don't know if you meant it, but
I did.
This is one of the things that I didn't do well early in my sort of action writing, and that is conflict should be in service of the character trying to solve a problem. If it's just conflict for the sake of, a good friend of mine is half of James S.A. Corey, and we bonded over our love for heavy metal. And he likes to say that his value to that series is that he's able to tell them when an explosion needs to happen, meaning something's got to happen. But that's a little tongue-in-cheek because the purpose of those scenes should be, it is thrilling, but you want your character to be solving a problem. If they're using a magic system, hopefully they're learning a little bit more about how to use that system. So the scene's accomplishing multiple things in addition to just being, putting the character at some sort of, bodily risk. The other thing that I made a lot of mistakes early on is I would slow the action down by diving into character reaction during the fight. Mm-hmm. That can be done if you do some time dilation and if possible, but it's risky, especially if you overuse it. The time for a lot of reflection on what happened should come later. If you do it in the middle of the battle, it's gonna slow down. You want some raw emotion, but you're not going to take time to think about how this particular, sword blow really was like the first one you ever trained with. And you loved that trainer so much. And where is he now? I should really see him when I'm done with this fight. You don't need all of that. And I know it sounds silly, but it's the difference between a good fiction action scene and what Brandon tells me is called an RPG action scene. Yeah. And the latter is cool, but not when you're writing a book.
And following up on this, because I write humor, as the swordplay is happening, if the character pauses to muse about how this particular move is just like slicing bread, and I could really go for a sandwich right now. Because I'm writing comedy, that's the kind of thing I can get away with.
Right.
There is a reward to the reader for having stepped away from the sword fight. The reader went into the sword fight wanting to know how the sword fight ends. And then in the middle of the sword fight, I'm talking about a sandwich. That needs to be a really good sandwich joke.
We're going to have a whole bunch of fighting sandwich books come back as a result of this panel.
If that is my legacy to fiction, I've committed a horrible crime.
Well, you can use the sandwich thing, but it has to be used in a very specific way. Like, you're trying to very definitely show that the character whose head you're in so far outclasses anyone they're fighting that they're thinking about their lunch. That's like, it's a technique, but it's a technique you use very sparingly.
Gosh, that makes me think of that Princess Bride fight. And they're having that dialogue while they're like trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
I am not like Henry.
Okay, when you are crafting your stories, at what point in the writing process do you break out the toolbox and start looking at pacing? Is that something that's built into your outline? Is that something that happens just during the discovery process? Is it something where you have to fall back on craft? Talk to us about this. How do you do that?
So I tend to start, I've actually always been really bad at this, and as I'm getting in further into my career, I'm trying to be better. And so the technique that I've kind of adopted the last couple of books is that I will start off with the kind of like the 3-act structure, and I literally have a whiteboard that I draw 3 little arches on, and then I write the major thing under them. But I also consider every individual scene to be a little tiny arc. And it's a method of planning that kind of allows me to look at each scene individually and say, this scene needs to have a start that gets the reader's attention and either is presenting a problem or continuing a problem that I've introduced already. And then the middle is going to be dealing with that problem and probably a sub-problem that I've already introduced. Something that's smaller, maybe a little more character-oriented rather than saving the world. And then ending on either the problem escalating or the problem being solved and hinting at a new problem that needs to be introduced. And that's kind of just a very basic structure I use for attacking scene planning. And it allows me to just, focus in and then be able to move individually between scenes.
When I got my first edit letter back for my first book from my editor, he sent an article, and I'll see if I can find it if anybody wants to come see it. It was a breakdown of The Martian, and it was how that book worked, yes, according to pacing. And I've been held to the standard since I read that article. The first plot point should hit at exactly 25%, which means I'm mathing my book the entire time. The midpoint should hit at exactly 50% of your manuscript, and then you should have your second plot point hit at exactly 75. It takes a lot of practice to know what those plot points are, and sometimes a little bit of direction from your editor. As I said, it should be a mixture of your internal and external conflict. It should be your biggest decision at the end of your first scene, and you break into 2. When you're doing revisions and page numbers are moving around and you're moving scenes, I feel like I'm constantly trying to make sure that I've hit that pacing point at 25, 50, and 75%. What this does is it's supposed to make it so that your reader, right about the time they're getting tired with whatever you're doing in that act, or they might have had enough, you switch everything up and you move on to the next one. Your reader has an expectation at 25%, you're going to introduce new conflict, that you're going to move on to your midpoint or your second act of your story, and then so on. And I have seen without fail that if you do that, it makes an unput-downable book. So I know it's a lot of math, and it's a pain, and it's really hard, especially when you're doing revisions, but constantly check and ask your beta readers if you know what that first plot point is, and if it's at 25%, your midpoint, and then your second plot point. They should hit those marks as close as possible as you can make it.
One of my favorite examples of what you're describing there, I'm sure we're all familiar with it, the first Avengers movie, the big fight in New York, and just as I was starting to feel action movie fatigue, Thor and Hulk are fighting on top of the big thing, and I'm like, okay, wow, this has gone along, and then side punch, laughter, relaxation, and now I am no longer tired. I'm ready to move on with the rest of the film. And I don't know if they use math, but they predicted me to within 3 seconds in that film. And so the mathematical approach...
It's big, and it's a pain, I'll tell you now.
Peter?
I agree with what's been said, but what I'd hate for you to go away thinking is that there's one archetype for writing a novel that's unput-downable. There are novels that have a 5-act structure. There's the Lester Dent model. There's another model, the name of which I'm forgetting, but there's rising escalation with failure throughout the entire novel. So it's good to understand these structural, uses, these structural models, and then think about maybe even the genre that you're writing. And if you're writing a romance, the 3-act structure doesn't work. So a little bit of it may depend. Like, how many of you are writing science fiction and fantasy? That's your thing. All right. How many are writing romance? Okay. How many are writing?
Okay, hang on just a second. What you've just looked at is the 1% of the room that's going to make money.
Yeah.
They laugh like it's not true. How many of you aren't writers? It's okay. All right, it's awesome.
What are you taking notes about then? She's a journalist.
Okay. Nice callback. Well, all right, sorry.
No, that's a good aside. The thing that I've always found is the litmus test for unput-downability is it being interesting. And I know that sounds super glib, but there are books that have no plot, that are just character books, that I can't put down because the character is so fascinating. I will just continue to read the character. Not going to give examples because I draw hatred from you. But they're books that we love. They're books that are commercially successful. They're books that have no plot, and yet they come from some of the biggest names in our field. So when you're the litmus test, I think is are you drawing interest? And that can happen with this. And so as a function of pacing, it's not about whether or not there's mortal conflict. It's not about whether you're in a reprieve and that you're able to breathe and you're able to understand the character's feelings. It's really about what's on the page. Is it engaging you? And this can happen in a lot of ways. It can happen. I'm not one of those. There's some people who won't write a flashback. And I think that's crime, because I think flashbacks are an absolutely valuable tool that you can use in your writing. Those can be as compelling as anything else. So there's a little bit of what I'm saying, which is learn the rules and understand how to apply them, but don't get too rigid in how you try and write your novels, right? Because some of the very best examples I could give you, and I'll tell you in the hall, so that I don't draw your ire, are novels that I know you love, like if I ask for a raise of hands, that violate everything we've said from a sort of, hey, here's our rules for doing it. So how many of you are published? Okay, so a lot of you are looking for that first publication, and so it's good to internalize structural, advice, but it's not gospel. So the litmus test is to be interesting, and that's really crappy advice, because okay, well, how do you be interesting? But you know it when you read it. So it's all of the things we've said in terms of action and character response to things. It's tension in dialogue. where your characters' motivations are at odds with each other. And then we could get into a whole thing around the pacing of using fragments and how long a paragraph should be, how long a chapter should be. Those are all tools that you asked us about structural tools, and you should learn all that stuff and apply them. But if you want to actually create a different kind of tension, write a paragraph that goes 2 pages. I've seen this, and for me, you guys can disagree with me, we can debate it. But I read a book by Joyce Carol Oates, and she did this. It was a woman who was abducted and raped, and she had a paragraph that went 2 pages, and I was spiraling down with her, and it was one of the most tense things I've ever read. Right? This was not the sort of typical advice of, hey, keep it short and snappy, one sentence or 2 sentences or 3 sentences. So she was teaching me that you can use different devices to achieve the same goal.
If you don't give me white space, I feel pain.
Yeah. So I talked for too long, but I just that's my soapbox. He asked me for a soapbox. There's my soapbox.
The next question I want to ask is, what are the kinds of conflicts that you will bounce back and forth between? Give me some examples. And while you're chewing on that, I want to give you an example of a very low pressure conflict. I would posit that everybody here wants you to have a good experience in the panel. We are all very unified in the goal that we want them, I'm talking about you as them because I'm talking to them as you, want them to have a good experience. The subsidiary goal is that you want, and this sounds terribly crass, you want to be remembered. You want them to come away from this event with you want to have made an impression. And I was a marketing puke, guys. This is just what happens. When I talked at the beginning of the panel, I told Peter, I said, if you've got a soapbox, let me know what it is so that we can direct you to the soapbox. And he said, no, I like the soapbox to just happen. We have the same goal, but his methods suck. And now there's conflict, but nobody's killing anybody.
You used the F word on me.
Yet.
I did, and it was fun. So.
I just got that. It was not fun.
So, conflicts. Tell me about your conflicts. What do you use? Internal, external, when you're pacing?
Ooh.
Or Brian, or...
Go ahead.
I tend to think of it in 2 different ways. One is scale, and that means whether the conflict is inside our point of view character, or rather that it's inside the character, but rather that it matters to just that character. And then, a little bigger is that it matters to that character and the group of people they're with. A little bigger is that character and the army or the country. A little bigger is the world. So I tend to think of it in scale, and then in terms of whether it's going to give me action or not. So I write kind of military epic fantasy, so I'm expected to give the reader fairly frequent action. And that's something I have to keep in mind as I'm going. Because if I go too long and nothing, no stabby bits happen, then I'm going to get a comment from my editor or my beta readers or whatever. And so... I try to keep in mind my audience, which is a thing you can do as an amateur writer, but it's also kind of a slippery slope. When you're writing for a certain genre, you may have an idea of who your audience is and how they expect your books to be paced. Like we said earlier, thrillers, suspense novels, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, they all have their different type of pacing. And the readers expect different types of pacing from them. So that's something I like to keep in mind. But yeah, the scale is a big part of what I do, because I want 2 different scales to be happening in every scene. I want something big happening and something little happening. The big thing might just be, you know, a small army unit and how it affects them, and the little thing is a relationship between two characters. Or the big thing might be the world-ending event, and the little thing is the army unit trying to survive. So that slides all over the place, but I try to use that technique when I'm working on it.
I like to give my characters something that makes them a bit of an outcast in their world. I build a world that they kind of don't belong to. Creates a lot of external conflict, but I also like that to be internal. I'll give you an example. My new series, my main character has a clock heart. And in her world, if she's found with this clock heart, she's going to be labeled a sorceress, and they burn sorceresses. So not only does she not have a heart and believes she cannot fall in love, but if anybody hears the ticking or finds this out, she's in mortal danger. So it has multiple different levels of conflict. And I took this girl with a clock heart, and because I wanted to create more conflict, I put her in a world where she's not just unusual and maybe a little bit of a freak, but also she could die over being found out. So when you build your character, you want to build this crucible kind of around your character of all these different ways that the world is going to potentially impact that character, things that are internal and external. And I keep saying that because they're different things, but sometimes they can be the same thing. Her clock heart is both.
I love that. This is a technique that I'm using in the novel I'm currently working on. A character has a secret, and if she reveals that secret, someone she just met but identifies with is almost certainly going to die. And then there are other things happening, and that other person has provided her with information that is pertinent to what is happening. So as we have the large scale of action happening, at a smaller scale, when she is communicating the question, well, how did you know that? There is now tension for the reader, because how she answers that question is life or death for somebody who's not in the scene. And so, yeah, I mean, life or death may seem like a big thing, but just letting slip a secret, that can make the idea that a one wrong word in dialogue has big consequences, turns the whole dialogue into exciting, fun tension.
Can I
go ahead?
For me, a lot of the reason the tension works is because of your personal investment in the character. And that happens on both fronts in the model that we are supposed to have been discussing around, what is it, Swain?
Scene sequel.
Scene sequel. Because if you care about the character and you're not a writer whose characters never die, then when they're in a mortal conflict, you may actually worry for them. But that doesn't happen. This is why it's difficult to have an opening scene be a battle or a fight, because you're not emotionally vested yet in the character you're supposed to be following. So it might be cool to watch, but it becomes effectively an RPG action scene. You can trick that a little bit. Maybe trick's the wrong word. A technique would be if the person that if your hero is entered into that action in defense of somebody, and they're doing it for a reason that you can get behind, then you're cheering for them and you're emotionally invested that what they're doing is by doing, you're starting to identify with the character. But the other side of that, where I think more of it happens, where you get more character investment and therefore care more later in the novel when they're going to be at risk, is those quieter moments where they're not at risk, they're not fighting. In the book I'm working on now, the main character is a musician. And Brandon and I were talking about this scene where Perrin is doing some blacksmithing. That's, I guess, a fan favorite. And I said, well, what I'll do is I'll do a scene where this character is songwriting. And so there's this whole scene where the character, it's actually about half the scene, spending time with his music. And you really start to understand what motivates this guy, why you should care about him, what his worries and fears are. And so then as we establish that, now you're cheering for him to go and achieve his goal. So this sort of ebb and flow of there's action in the world and tension, you can drive that. A lot of the engine for that is investing your readers in the character. And you can do that in a lot more ways than I've described. But if the reason they're involved in action is something that's got good motivation, but also in those other scenes where you don't have to have a lot of fighting going on, but you're getting a chance for the reader to get inside the character's head and start to understand who they are and what they care about, then you can create that emotional investment. And this is why it can ratchet across the entire book or series, is because your investment in that character grows.
Okay. Last question for you guys, then we'll open it up for audience questions. Any personal moments of triumph of craft for you, where you've been stuck, or something's been broken, and you've fallen back on craft, and it's worked for you, or maybe you're just perfect on the first draft and it always works?
I tend to I can't remember any particular examples, but this is a thing that happens to me all the time, is I tend to write and pace very much on gut feeling, on this feels right. And I get better at that with each book, but I'm also trying to support that with craft more with each book. And often what happens is, instead of saying this feels wrong and then just kind of like feeling gross about it for 3 weeks and not writing, instead of that, I'll say this feels wrong, why? And I'll try to diagnose. And I'll use all these craft tools we've been talking about to diagnose the scene and figure out why my gut is telling me that this is not working. And it almost always works. And sometimes it requires the change of a single sentence. And other times I have to rewrite the scene or rewrite several scenes. And that's just, kind of how it works.
Oh, gosh. I feel like I'm always working on the scene sequel thing. There's so much exposition in a first draft, so much. And then as I'm revising, I feel like I'm able to more separate those emotional beats and give them their proper moment. So I like to kill characters. Not always is it appropriate in the scene to have your main character completely dissolve. Sometimes it just, even if it's someone super appropriate, the whole world isn't going to stop so they can kneel and, put their hand on their heart and have their big whatever soap opera moment. Sometimes they don't get that. Sometimes they keep going and the conflict keeps going, and that safe moment where they can have that thought about what happened and the real emotional purge of it happens several pages later. And instinctually it feels wrong, because you feel like you should give your character a moment to have a bit of a breath, to really mourn someone, but that generally isn't how it happens. I know on battlefields it just doesn't. It generally happens later. It always happens in my first draft, and then I move it. So that is my one thing that I'm constantly like, oh, I feel so bad about killing you. I think it's guilt. It's not actually my character. It's probably just me. And then I get over the guilt, and then I write it right.
The one that comes to mind for me, I'd be a liar if I said it. I always get it right. But I've been more cognizant on pacing for the reasons that you were talking about, because it's urban fantasy. And so with the book I'm working on now, the thing that, when I turned in the first draft, the thing that Brandon says, you nailed the voice, you nailed the pacing. So that was really good. But the thing that I'm very proud of this, by the way, and if he were here, he'd acknowledge this, but this 3-act structure I actually brought to fruition one of the main character arcs after Act 2. Brandon says, I never do that. I always do it at the end of Act 3. He said, this is really interesting. And he said, and you wrote it so well, we're going to keep it. And what happened is there's this moment where the character, he's a musician, as I mentioned, and he does something music related that has really defined him his entire life. And it's sort of this exultant moment and cathartic moment for him, but it happens 2/3 the way through the book. So then it's like, okay, so what happens in that third act? And of course, we already architected what was going to happen, but it was the right time for it to happen, and it's instinctive. And so I think I heard you both say this, and you guys should absolutely trust your narrative instincts. You won't always get it right, but you spend enough time at the keyboard and reading other novels and coming to things like this, you'll develop those, and oftentimes trusting those is a really good thing. You won't always, like I said, you won't always nail it, but those first drafts, there's a lot of gold. I remember listening to Orson Scott Card talk about this, and he said, even my mistakes suggest things to me. And so, I like what Brian talked about and really staring at something and knowing that it's right, like he trusted himself, and if it's not working, doing some diagnosis. That's the difference between writing a good novel and writing an excellent novel, putting the time in to get those things right.
All right. I'd like to open it up for questions. Before we do, I want to emphasize that a question begins with a question word like who, what, when, where, why, how, and ends with a question mark, which implies that you're asking a question. If you have a statement to make and you can find a way to word it as a question, awesome. Okay, in the back with the hat.
Okay, thanks. Movies used to be different. I'm old and I watched Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and it's just pretty dang slow. And nowadays it's fast, faster. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is elegantly written, but it's not quickly paced. So my question is, how much action or scene switching is needed in books today to be read and to be published?
Ooh, I don't think being read and being published are the same thing. And like it or not, there's a number of them here at the convention that are successful writers who are not published through New York anyway. This is a soapbox that I don't think I should get on because we need to get to a lot of questions. But I'm not of the opinion that you should kowtow to publishing standards around pacing in order to get published. Having said that, there is the sort of commercial need, like if your idea is to be able to, afford your groceries with your writing, understanding all of this stuff and writing those books. But there's some books that in our field that are lovely. Language is first rate. You could say they're slow by a pacing standard, but they're so damn interesting and the characters are so great you follow along. So I would learn this stuff, but I would not superimpose it on your story for the sake of commercial success unless that is your only concern.
You need to read a lot in whatever genre you're writing. You need to read and see what's selling and notice what the top sellers are, understand what's working in them, and if you decide not to do that, know why. That's really what it comes down to.
It's worth pointing out that the screenplay format, the Save the Cat
Save the
book,
Cat. Mm-hmm.
Save the Cat and Swain are both 30 years old, and are not prescriptive things that defined the form. They were things that grew out of the existing form. Mm-hmm. And the fact that those things still apply to modern books, modern cinema, suggests to me that the question you're asking might not be the right question. The question might be, why does Casablanca, which adheres to the Save the Cat formula beautifully, why does Casablanca feel slower to me than, I can't think of it.
Legally Blonde.
Legally Blonde.
It's in the book.
Okay,
it's in the book. I'm just saying, he uses an example in the book.
But asking that question with both pieces of media in front of you may go a long way towards helping you resolve the conflict for yourself. Next question. Right in front of the hat.
So earlier Brian mentioned that at the end of a scene, like you either fail to solve the conflict or you solve it and then there's like the introduction of another conflict. So I'm assuming that's like a variation of the yes but no and format. How do you keep the even if you successfully solve one conflict, but it's like immediately undermined by the introduction of another conflict, how do you keep the reader in the mood all the time and sad?
I didn't hear the very last sentence you said. How do you keep it wet?
How do you keep it from just being like a complete downer? It's like there is no joy in this world, and you were failing at everything.
I mean, you just don't have your characters be all depressed.
Peter already gave us the example, which is give us some triumphs through the book. The try-fail cycle doesn't have to be fail, 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 win, ending. Fail, fail, win, fail, fail, big win. No, that was really a fail. Fail, fail, win, fail, win, big win. That's going to feel more fun.
I'll give you an example that I think answers, for me, both questions, and that's the book and the film Shawshank Redemption. For some people, that you could argue it's slow. Like there's not a lot of prison fights, those kinds of things that you might expect. It's not a typical Prison Break film. But for my money, that is an absolutely fascinating, beautiful film, start to finish. And I just reread the novella. And I think it answers this question of a narrative approach that does not, circumscribe itself to the scene sequel form. And I also think that what it does is in an overall sort of gloomy atmosphere with people committing suicide because they become institutionalized, there are these moments, these gestures of humanity that just shine so bright inside of that. And if you haven't seen the film, or read the novella, you should do so. It's a beautiful study in writing and fiction.
Yes, sir.
How do you know that your story doesn't need its pacing to be pushed so hard, or that you're going too fast and focusing too much on pacing, and your story wants to maybe slow down and have more character-centric focus?
So, rephrasing, how do I know if it's going too fast?
Yeah, or that your story doesn't want to be a faster-paced story.
I lose interest in the reader. I mean, in the character. If I lose interest in the character and what's happening next, then I probably push the reader too far. Does that make sense? So I think through beta reading other people's manuscripts, quite often you'll find, if you start to lose interest, you tell them, I've started to lose interest, or this is moving too fast, or I don't understand what is happening now because you haven't stopped to explain anything that's going on. By reading other people's work and critiquing it, you'll also often find the places and gaps in your own where you need to fix it.
Emily, do you have a writers group that you work with?
I don't. I just swap manuscripts. Does that count? I don't have an official group where we go and share chapters. I've always admired those people who have that and been super jealous. I wanted in a group. Anyway, but can I apply?
I asked because what you described is so terribly important.
Yeah.
As a new writer, your instincts, a lot of them are wrong. A lot of them are wrong. Sorry. But readers can often tell you that. Now, as a first-time critiquer, their instincts are probably wrong too because they don't know how to fix the problem. Writing groups are absolutely fraught in this way, but they're a critical part of my process. Brian, do you have no beta readers?
Yeah. I use beta readers. I don't use writing groups.
Okay.
I'm the same. Finding a good beta reader, that's like gold.
Yeah.
That's like the lotto. If you find those people, treat them well.
Yes, ma'am.
At my stage of the game, I feel like I need formula. I understand what you're saying, Peter, but I think some of us who are a little bit earlier along in the process need to be, our hands need to be held more. So what are your favorite other books or ways to learn how to do pacing?
Save the Cat is really quite good.
They just came out with the novel. Save the Cat does a novel or writes a novel. Yeah, they came out last fall.
That is, and it gets a lot of criticism because when everything is written into the Save the Cat formula, we feel like movies have become cookie cutters or predictable. But there are lessons to be learned there that will apply whether or not you're using that formula. So that's where I'd start.
Okay, thanks.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I really like what you're saying about like the broad scale conflicts. How can you have a broad scale of conflicts from, the little internal external conflicts, and keep it engaging without falling to Spider-Man 3 syndrome, where everything is just so cluttered that the reader is hard to, it's like the reader doesn't know what's going on. Does that make sense?
That's actually really tough. It's a learned skill. And I write epic fantasy, so my stuff is expected to be a little cluttered, but my first, not whole draft, but my first, kind of 20, 30,000 words that I tend to rewrite several times before I go on to the first draft, the first couple attempts always tend to be way too cluttered. And it's it's learning how to stop and look at it and say, I am trying to get across way too much junk. I need to narrow my focus, deal with a couple of problems, and introduce only so much in terms of world building, so that I'm not giving my readers a headache. Because you can bore them by being too slow, you can bore them by being too fast, you can bore them by introducing too much stuff, because they just go, okay, I don't understand this anymore, I'm leaving. And that's a tough one to do.
I nodded my head the whole time.
There's a theater term that I use it as a humor technique, and it works great for this kind of thing. It's called noises off, which is when characters are reacting on stage to noises that are happening off stage. If you're running a theater production and somebody needs to die in a car accident, noises off. You have the car accident happen off stage and people react to it. Just knowing the term is sometimes all you need to do, because you ask yourself, is this big global battle thing something I need to go describe? Or can the character be watching the news and react to it? And so that is one of my favorite tools, because I hate drawing, like
What?
lots of people.
Oh. That pause really had me. I hate drawing.
I hate working harder than I have to. And so very often when there is a big scene, the first question I'll ask myself is, does this story tell itself better? Is the joke funnier if I make it a noises off joke? If I let you imagine the big battle and then I draw talking heads?
Reality, too, is, for me, when I have huge battle scenes, you can't focus on armies, and frankly, it becomes so generalized if you talk about thousands and thousands of soldiers. Your mind just can't really. So for me, anyway, you that becomes personified in the battle of the character that you're following. You can make mention of the fact that things are happening and it's at scale, but the cost or the consequences really come down to the person that's in front of you. And if you're emotionally invested in whether this person's going to succeed, or if failure doesn't necessarily mean they die, but then other people are going to die because they fail, then you're nodding to consequences that are far bigger than the battle, but you still have the battle in front of you. I've read manuscripts where writers tried to, make it feel huge because 10,000 people died. But unless you've ever witnessed 10,000 people dying, that's not going to mean anything.
Yeah.
It's too big.
Okay, we are out of time, so I'll go ahead and ask the last question. What is it, as pithily as you can state it, what is it that you would like to send this crowd home with?
Oh, start down there.
And my answer is whatever they said. I'm going to make Peter go first.
Oh, man. I know this doesn't sound awesome advice, but I think the cardinal rule of writing is to be interesting. And that can happen in a lot of ways. And so get your reader invested in your character, and then whether it's action or scene sequel, whatever it is, then I'm going to come along for the ride. And that can happen absolutely with sort of rigid structures that are proven and work well, and it can work just as well with a character study.
I'm actually going to follow up for that last question, which is learn how to narrow down. Learn how to cut dead weight from your narrative so that things can keep moving and you're not just, screaming random things at your audience.
I would say to work on your inner storytelling. So you consume stories all the time, and I would work on finding stories in everything, and in history, and in music, and in other books, and that will hone your own storytelling ability. Be looking for stories and what you like and don't like about them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Keeley.